LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we'll be discussing the much misunderstood and sometimes mystifying science of economics, of money and its role in the current perilous state of the world economy, a dire situation which affects all of us. Our guest today is Alasdair Macleod, who has a background as a stockbroker, banker and economist. Alasdair runs financeandeconomics.org, a website dedicated to sound money and demystifying finance and economics. He is also a senior fellow at the Gold Money Foundation and publishes articles regularly at goldmoney.com. Hello and welcome, Alasdair, and thank you for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
It's my pleasure, Greg.
We're here today to discuss the state of the global economy, which is a rather big subject, but it's something that's basically constantly in the headlines at any given time, but certainly very much since the crash of '08. And starting point for me today is basically that as far as the mainstream media is concerned, that crash was very much something in the past. It's something that's happened, it's been and gone, and yes, there are still some ripple effects being felt, but basically it's a historical event. But as I see it, this is something that's ongoing. It's not over. The world economy basically blew up towards the end of '08, and the bits of rubble are still dropping out of the sky. I mean, how do you see it as over and done and dusted, or very much still affecting all of us?
Well, it's very far from done and dusted, and really what it was about, it was the whole of the sort of Keynesian paradigm, whereby you cheapen the cost of money, which leads to expanding bank credit, putting more money into the system. The build-up of debt on the back of that finally shuddered to a halt. And that is a very, very major event. And you're right, it's not just something that was in history and we just move on. No, because we're still dealing with the fallout from the end of really what amounts to, I suppose, nearly 100 years of expanding the quantity of money in the economy without it being fully backed by gold.
Well, sorry,
go on.
No, I was just going to say this is something that a lot of people don't understand, is that the sort of monetary paradigm that we have today, they kind of think that's been in place forever, but of course it's relatively recent, as you say, basically 100 years.
Yes. Well, I think most people, most historians of money would reckon that the founding of the Federal Reserve Board, the American Central Bank, marks the beginning of the modern era of paper money. America was on the gold standard certainly before the First World War, and then after the First World War, she resumed sound money. She actually jacked up interest rates at the time when the post-war depression hit America. I mean, can you imagine doing that now? Anyway, she jacked up interest rates, but the result of that was the reintroduction of sound money did something that the Keynesians just don't understand. It actually helped the economy sort itself out, and before very long it was recovering and back on track as per normal. So you had a recession, a very sharp recession, which, if you like, unwound all the distortions as a result of World War I. That recession in America lasted no more than about 2 years. And then, of course, we had the Roaring Twenties afterwards, which to a large degree was fueled by credit produced by the Federal Reserve Board. And that was the first time the Fed really started to stimulate the economy by producing extra money and encouraging banks to expand unbacked credit. So that was really the start, I think, of the modern monetary era. We started a bit earlier than that, insofar as Peel's Banking Act of 1844 legalized the Bank of England's paper money on the basis it was backed by gold. But it didn't tackle the problem of expanding bank credit. So you still had various credit-related crises, such as the overend Gurney crash in the 19th century. You had the Barings crisis in the 19th century. And these crises actually find their echo today. I mean, the Northern Rock situation was quite similar to the way the Bank of Glasgow went bust. It went bust because the wholesale markets wouldn't provide it with the credit to keep going, and that was an absolute dead ringer for Northern Rock. The overend Gurney crisis was similar to what we have in America at the moment. Lots of banks going bust, basically because the collateral that they've taken in respective loans itself has lost value, and therefore left the bank exposed and insolvent. And then the Barings crisis was actually, I mean, that if I recall, was Argentina. And that was the Barings Bank extending loans towards one country in exactly the same way as banks around Europe have sovereign debt exposure, which is considerably greater than their equity. So, all these problems of expanding bank credit from the 19th century, we see happening time and time again. So there's nothing new in what's happening now, but we have unsound money, and the pile up of debt really culminating in that event, as you rightly described it, in 2008, and we're still dealing with the fallout. The fallout basically is that mountain of debt is trying hard in the private sector to contract, and as it contracts, banks. It's rather like the tide going out, it exposes the rocks, as it were. And the bank's balance sheets, when they start contracting, the fact that they're geared 10, 20 times the money they actually own in there, their shareholders' funds, as it were, means that they very rapidly start going insolvent. And that is, if you like, the central problem that we face in Europe and America, for that matter, at the moment.
Well, putting it in that historical context, then, as many commentators have commented, we could have seen this coming, and in fact, some people did see this coming. There were warnings about the situation coming from all over the place. I mean, I remember reading about people sort of saying that with the property market, for example, and the unsound loans that were being made to the in the US, that was a situation that's been building up for a long time.
Indeed, I was very amused. You may recall the Queen opened or attended something at the London School of Economics, and this was just after the 2008 credit crunch. And she asked, well, you're all economists, why didn't anyone see it coming? Which I thought was a lovely... it put it in a nutshell, really. It's
a question that people who aren't economists are asking, sort of a Joe public, as it were, is mystified by these sort of things. And of course, you switch on the mainstream media, and it's the same people in TV and radio studios across the world pontificating on the situation now and prescribing various remedies. And these are the people who didn't see it coming.
Well, yes, but I think there is a very good reason for this, Greg, and that is that everyone in the media, in the city, in government, they have studied the economics of Keynes. That is what they have been taught, and it's the economics of interventionism. That is the fundamental problem behind it all. The Austrian economists, those who follow the writings of von Mises, and the various people before him and one or two afterwards, actually could see this coming. It's what von Mises called the ultimate crack-up boom. We're not actually at the crack-up boom stage yet, but we're moving there. What von Mises meant by the crack-up boom is that if you expand credit, there comes a point where if you like, the value of the money starts going down and people actually have that final flight into goods. We're not there yet, but if we don't get off this course, there is no doubt that that is where we're going.
Oh, I mean, I've already said, I went in the post office the other day, and the woman who was serving me had the gall to suggest that I might like to take a look at one of their ISAs. And I said to her, well, what rate of interest are you offering? And she told me, and I said, well, that's less than even the official rate of inflation that the government states, which is artificially low anyway.
Yeah.
And I said, I'd be better off just buying a few pallets of dried food. Because I'm going to have to buy that in 6 months of the year anyway. That's going to protect my money. I'm going to lose money if I put it with you. So when you said flight into goods, it reminded me of that thought that,
Yes.
to buy anything that you'll need to use in the future at today's prices is probably a better investment than sticking it in the bank.
Oh, indeed. That's right. And I think that there is another way of looking at this or tackling this problem, and that is that the situation we have at the moment is actually destroying people's savings. Your illustration of going to the post office is one example of that. But when money is printed and bank credit is expanded, now at the moment bank credit isn't expanding, so what they're doing is they're accelerating the rate of money printing to compensate. The effect basically is to transfer capital value from people's savings to the government, and from the government to the initial points of distribution. This is why the banking system has so much money, because that, if you like, is the spigot through which all the government-created money goes. And it's no wonder that all the bankers are doing so well, and we're all aggrieved about it.
Yeah.
The origin of the problem is government producing money and transferring the capital value from savings towards whatever projects the government thinks is worthy. So the savers are being actually killed. We don't have it quite as bad as in some other countries. If you look at what's happened in places like Greece, the banks that have managed to reduce their exposure to Greek debt have done so at the expense of domestic savers. Because guess what? The domestic savings, pension funds and all the rest of it have been directed by the establishment in Greece to buy Greek debt. And since it is all worthless, basically they're bankrupting, they're impoverishing all their pensioners and savers. And you cannot get any economic recovery, which of course is what the Keynesians want. They say, well, we can grow our way out of these problems if we just have enough money. You cannot have economic recovery without the investment in the capital goods to produce the products and services for tomorrow. And if you destroy all the savings, then the only source of money for if you like, acquiring those capital goods is by just printing money and expanding bank debt. Immediately you're building distortions on distortions on distortions, and you will never, ever achieve your objective. And this is where the whole Keynesian concept is beginning to fall over, and it's falling over really quite dramatically.
Yes, we say Keynesian. It's basically a way of thinking, a school of economics, and the Austrian school that you referred to is just another completely different, another world away, really. And it's something that's not discussed to the extent that if you were to set it out in front of the average person, they would say, I've never heard of anything like this before. This is like completely alien to me, what you're telling me about.
Well, that's right. But I think we have to draw a distinction between Keynesian monetarism and Austrian economic theory. The point about Keynesianism and therefore monetarism, which derives a lot of its assumptions from Keynesian assumptions, is that it's just that. It is all based on assumptions. And it's interesting, if you read Keynes's actual works, you can see that his starting point is that, the idle rich rentier who lends out his money and doesn't dirty his hands is evil. The person who is poor, impoverished, and works hard is deserving of benefit. So his starting point, effectively, is to transfer wealth or resources, national resources, whatever, between the idle rich capitalists to the hard up workers. Now, when he came up with this theory, you have to sort of put it in the context of the 20s and 30s. The sort of laissez-faire free markets of the 19th century, which made Britain and America so incredibly successful, had fallen out of fashion. And they were displaced by communism and national socialism, or fascism, if you like. Mm-hmm. And so you had these sort of Fabians, if I can call it that, who didn't really go into either of those two extreme camps, were sick and tired or disillusioned or not emotionally suited to appreciate laissez-faire capitalism. So they sort of found another way. And this was really what Keynesian economics is all about. You start with assumptions and you end up with a sort of an acceptable middle road which justifies government involvement in the basic economy. And the other thing that you have to remember is that in the 20s, the social structure from which Keynes came from was one, because he went to Eton. His fellow schoolboys were the sons of the landed gentry or the grandsons of the landed gentry. And typically, the acceptable careers for the son of a landed gentry, if he was the elder son, he'd probably end up running the estate and passing that down through the generations. Younger sons either went into the church, the army, where it would be a fashionable regiment, or the civil service. That was acceptable. The idea of a gentleman going into trade, becoming a stockbroker, was, my goodness me, no, that was an appalling thought. It just wasn't done. And this is actually why all the really clever Jewish immigrants who ended up in the city founded the big banking houses in the city, because our aristocracy were too posh to do it. They didn't want to soil their hands with trade. This was the background which Keynes came from. His father was a lecturer at Cambridge University. So he was in academe, as it were. So it was quite natural for Keynes to be an academic, sort of slightly sort of dilettante type. He was a member of the Bloomsbury set, along with Virginia Woolf and all those people. And he was, this was the world he lived in. It wasn't a world which understood commerce, things like prices. If I'm a businessman, I'm an entrepreneur, how am I going to make money? I wake up in the morning and think, I've got to be able to improve this or improve that or so. He doesn't understand that at all. And that's the economics that we've inherited, on which government today bases all its decisions. And it's a tragedy because it is so completely divorced from the real world. On the other hand, the Austrian school, and this is very accessible for, if you read the works of von Mises, particularly
Yes.
Human Action and Theory of Money and Credit, which I would say is two of his greatest works. But also he's got other great works. I mean, Socialism was a very, very interesting critique, and also Bureaucracy. Exactly why bureaucracy is a government function. It's not a function of the market. It's actually, I would recommend anyone to get hold of these works, which
Yes.
you can get for free on the internet now.
Not quite.
But the point about von Mises is that he actually rolled up his sleeves and thought about what is the effect of supply and demand on prices, what's the effect of money, what's the effect of interest rate, all these things. He actually puts it into a real working context, which you can understand. And I think throughout this, his great discovery was that the thing that really determines what is going to be used in the future, and therefore what determines how an economy progresses, is the consumer. It is the consumer's choice. He is the person who buys the product or the service. And there is absolutely no way that you can extrapolate what the consumer has done in the past to what he's going to do in the future. And as soon as you understand that, then it makes the whole sort of Keynesian paradigm where you take relationships in the past and you say that because the relationship of prices to money is X and we can come up with a figure which we'll call velocity and we can apply that to derive something else, it's actually totally meaningless because all that is in the past. There is no way that those statistics of the past can actually tell you what is going to happen in the future. And that's the fundamental difference, I think, or one of the fundamental differences between a well thought out theory, such as the Austrian economic theories, and the suppositions and prejudices behind interventionism, if you like, the whole concept of mixed economy, socialism, or communism indeed.
Yeah, and I would urge anyone listening to this to, if they are unfamiliar with the Austrian thinking, to seek out the books you mentioned, because a light will go on in your head, and you'll understand that there is a different way of approaching these matters, and which makes sense in the real world, as you said. If we could just rewind slightly, or to talking about the crash of '08. One slightly bizarre change in emphasis that I observed was that initially it was all about the banks, Lehman Brothers, and it was constantly talking about the problems with the banks. And then suddenly at some point in the media, the reporting became all about governments and deficits and government debt. And then that was all it was about after that we've spent too much for too long. We've lived, high on the hog, and we've got to rein in spending and get the deficit down. And for me, it was a bit of I don't know if you noticed this, but it was like, when did it become about governments and not about banks?
Well, there were two basic reasons why this is so, Greg. The first is that when banks start falling over, governments in this modern day and age say that they will stand behind the banks and they will guarantee that depositors get their money back. So immediately you start looking at, say, the relationship between the total capitalization of Swiss banks and the GDP of the Swiss economy, or the total balance sheets of the Spanish banks and the relationship, how many times larger is that total than the GDP of the Spanish economy? That's the first thing. The second thing is that underlying the background to the problems is a contraction in the general level of savings. Savings have been abused and abused. I've already referred to the abuse of savings by the taxation through inflation, which governments have been very, very happy to do. But there does come a point where if you've got a paucity of global savings, then the countries that cannot rescue themselves by printing more money are going to be exposed to the full pricing dynamics of the bond markets. And that's essentially what's happened in Europe. They gave away the function of printing money to the ECB, and they relied on banks expanding credit in order to finance their various government schemes. When the banking system no longer could do that, you had that sort of sudden change in 2008. It meant that the financing for European governments then had to exclusively rely on savings in the private sector. And the savings weren't there. The savings were being absorbed elsewhere, whether it was going into US treasuries or going into gilts or going into Norwegian kroner or whatever. The savings were just not there. People were picky. They would look at Greece and say, I don't really like this. And of course, there comes a point where if interest rates start rising, then the apparent financial position of the Greek government just looks worse and worse and worse. So the higher the rate goes, the less likely you feel to actually take the bait and say, well, I quite like 20% interest. So, the whole thing is sort of it's imploded on itself. And that is entirely logical. The first problem was the banks, and the second problem then becomes governments themselves. And it ain't over yet, as they say.
Certainly not. Regarding the bailouts given to many of the banks, I mean, a lot of people would think there's outrageous sums of money being thrown at banks with no apparent benefit to anyone apart from an elite few. I mean, in America, for example, someone calculated that for the money that they threw at a few banks, it would have been cheaper to give everyone, I can't remember what the exact figure was, but something really significant in the order of maybe $100,000, $200,000. And someone reflected on the actual difference this would have made to people's lives. Suddenly, the vast majority of Americans don't have mortgages anymore, and if they didn't own a house, then they'd have all this money in the bank. I mean, it might sound like, oh yeah, that's just pie in the sky nonsense, but actually, if any money ever moved anywhere, which it probably didn't, it was just figures on a screen, it would have been cheaper to bail out, quote unquote, the American public than it would have been the banks.
Well, you can't bail out the American public for the very simple reason that if you did that evenly, sort of the Bernanke helicopter drop, prices would rise across the board virtually immediately because that money would be spent. So it's a no-brainer understanding that one. Leaking it out through the banking system is very, very confusing for most people. The end result is the same. The problem is that it starts, people benefit unevenly. The helicopter drop, where everybody gets, let's say, a rights issue for their dollars. You had $1 before, you've now got two. That sort of thing has an immediate across-the-board effect on the prices of all goods. I mean, you go into the supermarket and you'd find that the price of lavatory paper would have doubled, more or less, within a week. You can guarantee that, and you can understand why. If, on the other hand, you leak it out through banks, then the banks are really. I mean, that's the way the financial system works. For a start, it goes through the banks, but then you see that the bankers are getting nice bonuses, the banks are making nice profits. Well, it figures because they benefit. They gear themselves up to benefit from the expansion in the quantity of money. That's what bank balance sheets are all about. And we see this. It hits the economy in stages. The first thing that happens is that you find that the prices in London are at a higher level than outside London. You find that the prices spread out from there because obviously some of these bankers who get lovely salaries commute, probably not very far because actually they work very hard and they work long hours. But you find that places like, Kent, Sussex, Suffolk, yes, well, wherever that, anywhere within decent commuting distance of London, the prices start rising there. And guess what? If you want to, buy a house there, the house prices are higher. If you want to get any work done on your house from tradesmen, they charge a higher rate than they do in the West Country down here in Devon, for example, where we're just surrounded by farmers and retired folk. And of course, from London it spreads out because that's the financial centre. But then you've got a finance centre in Edinburgh, and you've also got a little bit of a finance centre in places like Glasgow, certainly in Manchester. There's a lot of services businesses tied in with finance. So, those centres, they get the benefit of the spread. And all this is at the expense of, putting it simply, the fixed salary earners, the teachers, if you like, the nurses, and also of the pensioners. Because if they've got any savings, the purchasing power of those savings in total goes down because the interest rate is held down for those held down to try and stimulate the economy, as it were. Then the savers find that their interest income also collapses. I mean, they're hit every way you can imagine. But that's because they're last in the queue. By the time they get to the shops, the prices have already risen. Yes,
it's always occurred to me that an interest rate that is applied to loans and to savings it's kind of, there's that tension that it benefits one and disbenefits the other, and how you square that circle. Because the government's always talking about prepare for your old age and make sure you have a pension, and then on the other hand they're talking about keeping interest rates low for different reasons. And there's conflict there.
Yeah, well, there is conflict, but the only way that this can sensibly be resolved is through sound money, and that is that you don't print money and you leave the level of interest rates to the market. Take it out of the hands of government. It's actually got nothing to do with government, because all that government ends up doing is pursuing the policies that it wants to pursue. not the policies as Keynes hoped naively, are in the interests of everybody in the economy, because apart from anything else, you cannot measure those interests. There's no price on those interests. You can't measure it. All politicians do is they respond to pressure groups, they and central banks are the last people who should actually be fixing the price of money. They shouldn't be doing it.
The issue of central banks is also key, because a lot of people, for example, in this country, in Britain, there's the idea that the Bank of England is independent and they set interest rates, and it's been taken out of the hands of government. But a lot of central banks are basically, functions of government anyway.
Yes, I mean the independence is a sort of, it's independent in the management sense. That's all. But could you really conceive of the Bank of England pursuing monetary policies that would be seriously detrimental to the politicians? No. There's no way it's independent. It's a myth.
With regard to inflation, which we referred to, there's the figures that, because you hear it reported almost daily now. It's almost like a pacifier. Oh, well, inflation's not as high as we expected, and it's 2%, and it's coming down by point whatever. And then there's the real world, where people observe what they're paying for things and how that's detached from the official stated inflation rate. You observe this, in the States as well. Could you perhaps comment on the official inflation figures and how they're massaged downwards for political purposes?
Well, yes. I mean, they're rubbish is the short answer. It's extraordinary how you have an intense activity collecting all these prices and statistical method and all the rest of it. And if you get the UK Blue Book, it'll give you a long description as to how the methodology of getting the prices together and balancing them and doing this and doing that. It's absolute rubbish. There is no such thing as a general price level. It's actually as simple as that. This sort of concept of a general price level is something that only comes about on the back of fiat money. If you have sound money, then if people want to spend more money on one type of product as opposed to another, then they have to cut back their spending on another product. That's not the world we live in at the moment. What happens is that petrol prices go up. Nobody can be denied the use of petrol. So if you like, the demand for it is not going to go down just because the price rises. Simply what happens is that the central bank ensures that there is enough money in the system for us to pay those extra prices. And this idea that you can have a sort of a one statistic fit all price idea actually doesn't work in practice. I don't know about you, but the current expenditure I do are things like petrol, fuel for the car as it were, fuel to heat the house, groceries, things like that. I tend not to go out and spend money in the pub like I was when I was a young man, so we put that one to one side. But things, taxes, local authority taxes have not increased by a huge amount recently, but that could well happen down the line. You had VAT was put up by 2.5%. All I see is that at the end of the day, the amount of money I seem to get through doing my normal everyday things has gone up a hell of a lot. Now, I haven't sat down and worked out what I've actually spent it on, but I just know that prices are rising. The purchasing power of my money is falling. It's as simple as that. And measuring it by going around and checking the prices is actually a waste of time. The only way really to measure it is how much money is there in circulation and how much is it expanded by over the last given period. And that'll give you a far more accurate idea of actually what's happening to your money and what is about to happen to your money than, sort of plowing through supermarket prices and substitution because something's got more expensive and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a guy called John Williams who runs
ShadowStats.
Yeah, shadowstats.com. And I don't look at it very closely, but he works on the methods of putting these statistics together that were around about 20 or 30 years ago. So he takes out the distortions that have been put in since then. Mm-hmm. And so he ends up saying, well, working on the old basis, inflation is, 8, 9, 10%. Whereas the headline rate in America, you're looking at sort of 3 or whatever it is. I mean, and deflators on GDP. That's the other thing. There is a government interest in ensuring that the deflator on a GDP is kept as low as possible, because the more you deflate GDP, the less your real figure growth looks like. So the whole of the statistical thing is all about trying to prove the case for or justifying the case for government intervention.
GDP, basically, growth, the gross domestic product. Sorry, I'll come to growth later. A lot of people are also that's part of the jargon that's thrown at us by economic pundits. Perhaps you could say something about something perhaps people don't generally know about GDP and that they should know.
Well, this is a very, very interesting one. We all assume, and I even get people who understand Austrian economics, assuming that GDP, gross domestic product, is actually a measurement of growth of the economy. It's not. It's a measurement of the growth of the money that is actually in the economy. And the sources of that money are really threefold. Well, if we put to one side things like trade deficits and capital flows into and out of the economy from abroad. So if you look at a closed economy, effectively you've got 3 sources of that money. One is that the government prints money through the central bank. The second is that the banks expand credit on the back of printed money. So those are 2 sources. And the third source is there's a huge amount of this money slopping around as capital, which doesn't actually go into economic activity. Some of it leaks out from capital markets, either when companies go to the market in order to raise capital, or the government issues gilts. That takes money which the government then spends in the economy, which is fine. But there is still a large amount of capital that just goes round and round in circles, and that is becoming a very important part of the whole dynamics of gross domestic product. Because if you could persuade some of that money to go into economic activity, the provision of goods and services, and the purchasing thereof, then you get an increase in GDP. But it doesn't actually tell you what all that money is. GDP is just purely money. It's not an activity. If government expands its spending, for example, that is recorded as an increase in GDP. It's nothing to do with GDP, but this government element in terms of an accounting identity has to be included in the national statistics. I think probably another way of looking at it is if you were, let's say, looking at a proposition to buy a company, you would be given the balance sheet of the company. You would look at the balance sheet of the company and you would see assets, and you would see, plant and equipment and things like that, factories and so on and so forth. Now, I have a question. Would you actually take that on its face value and say, it looks to me on the basis of this balance sheet that this company is worth a figure which is X, so I'm prepared to offer Y for it? No, you wouldn't. What you would do is you would go out and you would look at those factories. You would look at the lathes and milling machines in those factories and see what sort of condition they're really in. You know what the book value is. You're not interested in the book value. You're interested in the equipment in the factories and the state of those factories as a means of producing something for the future. You can't get that out of a book. You can't get that out of the accounts. Really, any entrepreneur, any venture capitalist has to go on the ground, boots on the ground, and have a look. Try and assess the quality of the staff, the quality of the equipment, and all the rest of it. That's really what matters. The accounting identity is totally immaterial.
And of course, a lot of people aren't aware that when you're alluding to the fact that everything's accounted in GDP, that basically things that we would consider not positive are also counted. So if someone gets knocked over by a bus and an ambulance goes out to get them, the economic activity generated by that is counted as well. When it's reported in the media, it's kind of like an increase in it is only a good thing. But it could be for all sorts of reasons, many of them destructive and negative, that the figure has gone up.
Yes, exactly. And this was very, very noticeable when Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer. I remember at the time the City would produce forecasts for economic growth, growth of GDP, which were always turned out to be less than what the Chancellor at the budget was able to say he had achieved. The answer was quite simple. He just spent more than anybody assumed. And of course, if you spend more, government spending is included in the statistics as a positive. It is GDP. But actually what he's doing is he is taking money away from the private sector where it is efficiently used and redeploying it in the government sector, where there is absolutely no basis of value that can be ascribed to that money. And not only that, but the money is spent in directions which the politicians want. I mean, if there is a satisfaction in the spending, say, on education and roads and health, and it is wanted by people, it is actually by coincidence rather than it cannot be done by any government planning. Government planning does not work. It's simple. And the extreme example of that, of course, we saw with the collapse of communism, which is actually planned economies. The Chinese are still planning, but that's a slightly different story.
It is. Just to do a bit of a 90-degree turn here, one thing we mentioned earlier, which I was going to come on to, was the subject of Greece and just generally what's happening in the Eurozone. I mean, a lot of people, myself included, are probably trying to fathom why Greece? What on earth is going on in that tiny little country that was seemingly minding its own business, albeit in an inefficient manner for such a long time? Why is that the nexus for so much of what's occurring in the European economy and, to some extent, the global economy?
Well, I think Greece is just an extreme form of what is common throughout the Eurozone and indeed in other jurisdictions. For years and years, government has had easy access to money. Remember, when they went into the euro, going into the euro saved them from bankruptcy. There was no way they could borrow money in the markets at anything which made any sort of sense to the government of the day. So they went into the euro, which really meant that when they went into the capital markets to borrow money, they were paying a far lower interest rate. They were paying more than, say, the Germans were when they issued debt. But there was this sort of implied cross-border guarantee that, it's euros and it'll be guaranteed by the whole system. So, yeah, we're happy to take, a 5% return on our money lending it to Greece, whereas we would expect only, say, 4% from Germany. That was the sort of split that you had. The result of this freely available bank credit meant that Greece, as well as all the other countries, they dipped into that and they took as much of that credit as they possibly could. And they expanded their spending. They expanded their corruption in many cases. They didn't have to tackle their underlying problems, the economic problems. I mean, it's one of the things that has been quoted often over this is that the cost of running the Greek railway system is so great, it would be cheaper to put everybody in a taxi. And civil servants and everybody in Greece retiring at something, 50, 55. I mean, the whole thing was just spending not taxpayers' money, because nobody was, the tax collection system didn't function properly either. But it was just all borrowed money. And if you can borrow money with no responsibility, I mean, whoopee, it's party time. And that party's now come to an end. Now, it's sort of fairly spectacular over Greece. And of course, you've got all the commentary as well. How can you actually justify taking Germans' savings and applying that to propping up essentially a bust economy? It just doesn't make any sense at all. Perhaps we can persuade them to feel guilty for their past or whatever. But it just doesn't make any sense. And I think what we're seeing now is it's going to be moving from the economic scene to the political scene. I think that Greece was the first domino to fall. And the idea that the powers that be have managed to resolve the Greek issue and hopefully create the precedent so that that's not going to be followed by Portugal, Spain, Italy, whatever, Belgium, whatever, that is a forlorn hope. The way they have handled it has actually accelerated the likelihood of contagion into other debt markets. And the reason I say that is very simple. As part of this process, and again, it's completely understandable, government agencies lending money to Greece have interposed themselves in the credit chain between the debtor, the Greek government in this case, and the private sector lenders. So if, let us say, you're a bank and you'd lent money to the Greek government, you suddenly find that you're a junior creditor. Now, what this does is it makes every bank management committee sit up and look at their exposure to European debt and say, oh, hold on a minute. We are, to use an Australian, if you'll excuse me, there's an Australian farming expression which I think sums it up totally. We're sucking on the hind tit. And if you, now that principle has been established, that private sector creditors are last in a queue which is getting longer and longer to get their money back, you can see that makes it even harder for Spain and Italy, let alone Portugal and anyone else, to go out and borrow money from the private sector. It's just not going to happen. So the pace at which these bankrupt governments start falling over, I think, is going to quicken as a result of the way they handle Greece. And it's not just going to stop with Greece. Okay. So that brings us on to, I think, the next phase of it. And that is a political problem, because really what we're saying is that the whole of the political structure itself is at fault. And that is the thing that has got to be demolished. And at some stage, whether it starts with the Germans or with Finland or Holland or, someone who's actually got voters' savings on the line here, they're going to say, well, look, we can only go so far and no further. We're out. Yes. And I think that's where the problem is going to come, not from Spain, say, turning around and saying, well, we can't possibly accept these terms. We're going to leave the euro. I mean, I think you can forget that route. It just doesn't make any sense at all. But what does make sense is the political disintegration of the whole of the European project. Now, that is, I think, a very interesting, and it brings a lot of dangers, but potentially a lot of benefits if someone's got the sense to understand how by removing this source of over-regulation and control over the private sector, there is a possibility that we can do something.
Well, yeah, I mean, my question, you partially addressed it, was like, where is this going? So let's fast forward, project, over the next year, next 2 years. I mean, what the future you've sort of outlined, what does that look like in more detail, potentially?
Well, I'm afraid there's only one place it's going to end up, and that's von Mises's crack-up boom. Is what happened in Germany in 1923. People just couldn't get their money fast enough and put it into goods. The way we get there is actually quite simple to understand. The first thing that we can say with absolute certainty is that no bank, reasonably, is too big to fail. And the result is that all banks will be rescued. Why? Because they must keep the ATMs going.
Yes.
The moment you and I go to the hole in the wall and we can't get cash out of the wall, then the politicians themselves are dead. So that, I think, is the fundamental priority faced by every central bank with whose government is profligate. They've got to keep the banks going. Above all, that's the number one thing. So this is why the ECB has printed, I've lost count of the trillions of euros. I think it's about 1.2 trillion. They've expanded through the LTRO programs. They've expanded their balance sheet by something like 3 trillion. And this has basically gone into the banks. The banks in Euroland, as elsewhere, they don't just rely on deposits from you and me. They go out into the wholesale markets. They borrow in those markets, and they also borrow by issuing loans, if you like, bank loans. Where they are the borrower, and these things come due after a while. Most of the bank debt that's financed through medium-term notes and all the rest of it has a life of something like 5 to 10 years on it, and the result is that quite a lot of that starts suddenly mounting up. So the bailout from the central bank has to take account of the fact that not only are depositors taking their money away from European banks, in some cases more rapidly than in others, but also the banks themselves are having to repay loans. So the money has to be made available for that. So we can see that the expansion of money supply just to keep the banking system going is very, very difficult to put any limit on at all. And then you've got the problem that governments themselves are all running massive deficits, or if they're not running deficits at the moment, they've got so much debt that the cost of refinancing is going to mean that they are going to go into deficits. If you look at Italy, for example, Italy runs more or less a balanced budget. But if Italy is faced with interest rates of 7-8%, something like that, then they're going to be looking at the wrong end of about 5 or 6% on the budget deficit. And the more the interest rates go up, obviously, the more they're in the hole. So you can see that even though the ECB has restricted its money printing so far to supporting the banks, and some of it has leaked out into funding government debt, admittedly, which is why the rates have come down in Italy and Spain. The actual funding of these government deficits hasn't started yet, do governments fall over? No. At the end of the day, the central banks, maybe through supporting the banking system, will come up with the money so these governments don't fall over. So we can see the route over which this is going. Now, the reason that interest rates are not high in the US and also in the UK is because we can ease quantitatively, and that's what we're doing. So the Japanese have done the same. And all that means is you just print money, basically. And the reasons to do it are simple. It's got very little to do with trying to encourage businesses to invest and so on, which is the publicly given reason.
Yes.
It's actually got to do with the fact that it costs governments interest to borrow money, and they're all borrowing very hard. And if you had higher interest rates, then the budget deficits themselves would just whiz totally out of control. They're out of control as it is with zero rates. So the real reasons for the central banks printing money is not only to support the banking system, but very importantly, to support government spending. governments haven't started cutting their spending properly yet. I mean, even in this country, when Osborne stands up and talks about, trying to sort of correct the profligate past, I mean, he's not actually cutting spending overall. He's just slowing down its rate of growth.
Well, this is it, yeah.
Yeah, and if interest rates start rising, which they would do the moment the Bank of England stops doing quantitative easing programs, under those circumstances, you can see that the budget deficit would start rising very, very rapidly.
Well, with regard to government debt, we're often, especially in the US, they talk a lot about sort of balancing the budget and what have you. But, this is what infuriates me about politicians in this country talking about sort of, getting the deficit down. Governments run massive deficits. That's what they do. The government deficits do not get paid off, generally speaking, from a layman's perspective. This just does not happen. The debt just increases over time. And it's difficult to see where it would end up, or maybe it won't end up anywhere. It'll just continue until the end, the end of time. But it's this sort of idea that it's somehow going to be, during the Clinton years, there was some, hoo-ha about sort of balancing the budget. But as far as I remember, it was more like they just stopped the rate of increase, or it wasn't going up anymore, or something like that. But the idea of being paid off is just, la-la land.
That's right. There is a fundamental difference between government spending your money and you spending your money. By your money, I mean particularly your savings. Mm-hmm. When the government borrows your savings in order to spend, it spends it full stop. When a private sector entity, whether it's an individual or a company, borrows money, then generally, and you will make sure this is the case because otherwise you wouldn't lend money to that person or that company, generally they will use that money to invest in the business. And by that I mean that they will acquire capital goods rather than go and spend it in the in the restaurants and bars. Yes. And that is a fundamental difference. There is a return on private sector investment. Excuse me. There is a return on private sector investment over time, but there isn't on investing in government bonds. And so savings which have been taken out of the system totally have, there is absolutely nothing to show for it at the end of the day. They have been destroyed because they're not going to get repaid. That is for sure.
A lot of people speculate, if they're not conversant with economics generally, they don't quite know how to grasp potential answers, but why the cycles of boom and bust that seem to dominate our daily lives, why they have to happen in the first place, and why we don't have, to coin a phrase, a steady state economy, why things have to be in such flux, why something that was designed, money, was designed merely as a medium of exchange, has come to sort of dominate everything, and its movements rack every aspect of life across the entire planet, why that has to be the case. And perhaps you could address that.
Well, it's really if you like, the desire to get the economy growing by monetary means, and lowering interest rates encourages businesses and entrepreneurs to go out and borrow money in order to expand their businesses. But the problem arises when they actually do that and they find that the other resources necessary for expanding their business, which are basically raw materials, savings themselves, this is a savings replacement, but raw materials, savings, and also the labor in order to, the people you employ in order to produce more, they are not released by the process, because all that happens is that the consumer sees easy money, so he doesn't increase his savings. What he does is he continues to spend, and he probably on the margin goes and borrows some cheap money in order to spend a bit more. So the result is that, the consumption end of things, that continues just as it did before, and it doesn't release the resources for the expansion of businesses. And the result is that prices start rising. So it's a very, very simple factor. If you don't release the resources, the physical resources, any amount of producing money is not going to achieve anything. All it does is it distorts the economy. And inevitably, when businessmen realize that they have made a mistake, they find that the models that they put together aren't working because the cost inputs have been underestimated, for example. Then under those circumstances, they start sort of thinking, well, we've got to cut our investment here because we obviously made it under a false assumption. The result is that interest rates will have risen because inflation is rising, and the businessman then at that stage, when he starts cutting, that starts correcting, if you like, the false boom that was created by the excess money in the first place. But then governments don't like to see that, the downside of the recession, the downside of the boom. It's a cleansing process, if you like. But governments don't like to see that because obviously, rising unemployment and all the rest of it basically means a discontented electorate, and so they try and stop it by chucking more money at it. And the result is that you get these cycles of boom and bust getting just more and more unstable over time. And that the culmination of that process, as all the debt, the amount of debt in the economy increases and increases and increases over these cycles. And we got to that point in 2008 where suddenly the whole thing started falling over.
And the government, particularly in this country, won't even use the R word, recession.
No,
they just refuse to do it. It's just like, what's the phrase I like? Negative growth. It's like, can't you just call it what it is? And, someone's like, say, oh, well, I lost my job. A house is being repossessed. We're only eating one meal a day, but the government says there's no recession, so there isn't one.
Yes, but I mean the government is always very good at calling a spade a gardening implement. I mean that's why the Ministry for the Sick is called the Minister of Health.
Quite.
And the Minister for War is actually called the Minister of Defence. But anyway.
Well, the idea of economic growth, and this is something that just makes me want to throw the radio across the room when I hear it, is this is a sort of a mantra that has become that a growing economy is the only acceptable one. It's kind of thinking of my comment earlier about trying to have a steady state economy, sort of something that might be a bit boring, but actually it works for the majority of people. But perpetual economic growth, no matter how much it is supposedly essential, it is just not possible. And we see that anyway. And I think the pursuit of it is actually quite destructive.
Yes, I think I think we've sort of covered that from the monetary end. I mean, I hope that I've explained reasonably clearly that all GDP is growth of the amount of money in the economy, not the quality, if you like, of what's actually going on. The whole idea, the whole concept of economic growth, I think, actually does revolve around the statistical approach, looking at things like GDP and saying, well, if the GDP number increases, then surely that means that the economy is growing. It doesn't at all. And von Mises described it a bit differently. He said that an economy progresses. And I think that's how I like to see it. If you imagine a sound money situation, in other words, a situation where the amount of money in the economy doesn't change at all, at the end of a year, your GDP has got to be, guess what, exactly the same. It must be, because it's a money quantity.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, it would be totally wrong to think that over the course of the year, nothing has actually happened in the economy. It has. I mean, it progresses to a greater or lesser degree. You will find at the end of a year that there will have been improvements in products. You will have found that entrepreneurs will have found cheaper ways to make existing products. And so you will find that at the end of the year, prices will be down a little bit, which means that you can afford to buy a bit more. Your wages probably won't have fallen. They should have fallen because the purchasing power of them has effectively risen a little bit. And generally, the consumer's pretty well off under those circumstances. The entrepreneurs, They're, I think, sort of fairly ambivalent about it. What they want is they want sort of stability. They want economic stability because that allows them to plan something, execute it, and benefit from the rewards. Large companies, which are perhaps less entrepreneurial but more establishment, don't actually like that environment because it means they've got to compete. Because if prices tend to fall, well, that's not much fun for them because they haven't got the imagination, if you like. They feel they're established. They feel that they own that market, as it were, and they don't like the idea of someone else muscling in and producing something which is cheaper. So, they're the people who really don't like sound money, along with governments, which is why you have this unholy alliance of large companies and governments trying to fix things. Large companies saying that, of course, we will only manufacture in Greece if the currency goes down and cheapens the labor to the point where it makes sense for us. I mean, it's absolute rubbish. That's a very temporary gain, if you like, which gets expunged very, very quickly.
Well, you see this unholy alliance, as you referred to it, in the States, particularly with a revolving door between government, banks and corporations in terms of personnel. And it really is one entity in many ways.
Yes, it is. And of course, the whole of the political election process involves those three elements. And they're all sort of tied together, if you like, working towards a common objective.
Now, a lot of the concepts that you've been talking about regarding alternatives to the way things are done, actual or theoretical, hinge on the concept of sound money. So basically, just if people are not aware, it's quite different to what we have today. Sound money is basically money backed by something of value.
Yes. Historically, I mean, the what determines money has always been selected by people dividing their labor. And as a result of the division of labor, having to rely on others for the provision of goods, for which they would swap their own goods. And money, of course, is the important lubricant whereby you do that. And the selection of money has come really from that social activity. And the one thing that has sort of stayed with us throughout all those millennia, really, well, the two things have really been gold and silver. Gold predominantly is the higher value money. Because it was less, less abundant, that was replaced by fiat money, if you like, by law, where governments then took over the process and effectively have a monopoly on what you use as money. You can still go out and barter something, one for another, but everything has to be reduced back to money. I mean, if you barter one thing for another, you're going to, and you don't declare it in your income tax return, then, you find that the Inland Revenue are on your back. So as far as government is concerned, everything is in the paper money. And they have done everything they can to persuade us that this money is worth more than the paper that it's printed on. So really, if we return to sound money, there is only one thing or possibly two things that are going to represent sound money, and that's gold and silver.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's listened to our conversation will be saying, okay, guys, I get it. The world economy is a basket case. Where's this going? What are we going to do? And that's basically what it boils down to. And also worth pointing out, I think, that historically, all fiat, all unbacked, all paper money systems have failed eventually.
Oh,
and
completely.
the idea that this will not happen this time is a fallacy.
This time it's different.
Yes.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, we've all been educated in sort of modern Keynesian economics, which actually isn't economics at all. But we accept that this is economics. It's totally fallacious, and we're sort of rather like was it Hans Christian Andersen who wrote the fairy tale about the emperor who wore no clothes. We just don't notice that the emperor's got no clothes on. We see what we want to see. The future, once these problems are fully exposed, it's going to be very different. And that comes back to the point that you made right at the start of this interview about 2008. It's actually a major event, rather like earthquakes. It was a big earthquake, but there's more to come.
Well, people are probably asking themselves again. They've said, right, we get it. Trouble ahead, choppy waters. Things are going to get bad before they get worse before they get better. Rather, what can I do? Individuals, I think, feel, certainly in my conversations with people from day to day, they feel rather helpless, that they're just vulnerable to all these economic shocks, and there's nothing they can do to protect themselves or improve their position. Starting with getting out of debt, which I always tell people they should make their priority. We've talked about gold and silver, and again, I talk to individuals about this, the checkout girl at the supermarket, guy in the petrol station, anyone who will listen. And for most people, the idea of sound money having some relevance and reality in their everyday lives is esoteric at best. It's just seen as bizarre. But there are alternatives to just sitting around and having your savings destroyed and your economic future going up in smoke at the hands of others. Well,
yes, it's difficult to see what they are. I mean, if for a start, let's take money. You go to a portfolio manager, and the portfolio manager will come up with a sort of asset allocation which he thinks might suit your particular circumstances. Now, his idea of a risk-free investment is cash on deposit at a quality bank. But we know that cash on deposit is going to pay you very little, and is going to pay you less than the rate of inflation. So immediately, the risk-free portfolio investment is to lose money. And if you go from there, what other asset classes? I mean, I suppose you would talk about stocks and shares. Now, the value of stocks and shares depends on interest rates, because that is what they're measured by. So I put it simply, if BP pays a dividend of 3% and you're only getting 0.5% at the bank, then obviously you're probably going to want to hold BP rather than leave your money in the bank. I mean, once you take into account the extra risk of owning shares in a company, which can go up or down, compared with the stability of money, which is going down at the bank, but at least if you put in £100, you get £100 back, sort of thing. And then he moves into then he might recommend things like property, and property, bricks and mortar and all that stuff. I mean, we all like to own the roof over our head and so on. We feel that it's a stable thing, but that's a market which is priced on the back of borrowed money. I mean, if you took mortgages away and then said, okay, at what price is the residential property market going to clear? I don't know what the answer would be, but I would have thought that it would be probably, let's take a guess, half the current level. A third, because the whole pricing of the market does depend on the availability of mortgage finance. So there again, you've got, there are risks there, which, if you get the sort of economic instability of bank crises, government spending, borrowing crises, and all the rest of it, it's not a clear-cut case. If you go to the same portfolio manager and say, well, commodities, he might say, well, commodities. I don't know very much about commodities, but all I can say is that, for example, China seems to be buying base metals and so on. So perhaps that might be a long-term investment. But I wouldn't have too much in it for the very simple reason that it's very, very risky. And then if you say to him, well, how about gold and silver? He will say something like, well, I don't really follow gold and silver, and I don't really understand what they're about. Guess why? Because he probably came out of a university with an economics degree, which never even mentions gold and silver, where the assumption is that we have moved away from the iniquities, if you like, of a metallic standard, and we have something more modern and better. So he's not going to understand the argument either. So this is actually very difficult. So all you're left with, I think, is looking after your own affairs and taking the trouble to understand where the whole thing is going wrong. And I think that's very, very difficult for a lot of people.
I think that's probably extremely sage advice on which to conclude. I will just say that for my part, and I hope the Inland Revenue are not listening, that I piled in with everything I have in the entire world into gold and silver 10 years ago, and I'm glad I did.
Well, you were very prescient, Greg. That's all I can say. Well done. You would be. There are very, very few people who did that. It's interesting. Sorry, if I can just say one final.
Of course.
I think when Gordon Brown sold the gold, I mean, there was no doubt that from an Austrian perspective, we could see that marked a reverse bubble, if you like.
The brown bottom.
Yeah, it's the reverse of a bubble, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
And that certainly, for anyone who understood Austrian economics, was the simple conclusion of that action. Since then, the gold price has gone up and up, and it's had a fairly constant rise over time. And I think in every year it has gone up in virtually every currency, every paper currency. Since 2000. The portfolio interest has been very, very low. The average portfolio exposure, I think, works out at something like 0.75%, in spite of the fact that gold has gone up sixfold in that time. So nobody's really bought it yet. And we're now in the situation, I think, where central banks, they've seen the error of their ways. They say, well, oh dear, we can't sell this because, we might need it for a rainy day, which puts the lie to Keynesian economics. But that's in a sense the conclusion we can come to from central banks' actions. But then you've also got the problem now that the Asian countries, led by China, are all acquiring gold. I mean, even Iran bought gold last year and was very happy to announce it. India as well, though they're trying to stop, or rather, they're trying to tax their citizens buying gold to a greater extent now.
Yes.
But this leaves the Western central banks with a real dilemma because they have sold a lot of their gold. They refuse to have their gold holdings verified publicly. And the result is that we suspect that the level of gold holdings, which is actually reflected in the tables produced by the World Gold Council, overstates the holdings of, say, America and probably quite a number of the European central banks, while at the same time China, India, Iran, Russia, the various stans have all been accumulating gold and actually could come out with paper currencies which work for their own internal settlement to the exclusion of the dollar and the euro and sterling. Now, that is a very interesting concept. And if you think that the big power that the Americans have had over global trade is that with the dollar as the international settlement medium, every trade deal that isn't done for cash goes through the banking system in New York. And that gives them an enormous amount of intelligence and control over what's going on. It also allows them to expand their money supply abroad, reap the benefits at home without it appearing effectively on the books. So they've utilized that very, very effectively. And it looks like they're going to be losing that over the next 4 or 5 years. And if that's the case, then there's a whole new range of consequences, which I would have thought would take another hour and 20 minutes. So we'll stop there.
Right. Well, bottom line basically is, if you're in the UK, stop listening to bloody Moneybox on Radio 4 or whatever the equivalent is in your home country. And as you said, basically inform yourself about where things have come from, where they are, where they're going. Your website is financeandeconomics.org.
Yeah.
People can go there and find out a bit more about you and your work. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to point people to?
Well, yes. I write most of my articles now on the Gold Money Foundation website. So if you go to www.goldmoney. I can't remember the rest of it actually. Hold on.
Well, if you Google gold money, you find it. Yeah,
it's goldmoney.com. Yeah.
Yes.
And that was set up by James Turk, who's a good friend of mine. And I publish a weekly article, a short article on that, which then gets sort of circulated round. But if that's probably the best place to pick up my articles at the moment.
Okay, Alasdair Macleod, thank you very, very much for joining us today on legalisefreedom.com.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you, Greg.
Well, that's it for this time. Check out financeandeconomics.org for more information about Alasdair and his work, and also have a look at goldmoney.com, where you'll find numerous articles by him, and on both sites, of course, you'll find links to other relevant articles and interviews on the web. I'm Greg Moffat. You've been listening to legalisefreedom.com. Until next time, goodbye.